So this afternoon, we're going to have a great panel of doctors, and we're going to start off with, we're going to talk about clinical trials. I'm sure you all want to hear about what clinical trials are going on worldwide. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Lakshmi Rajdev from Montefiore. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and of course, Debbie and her entire team for doing such a tremendous job, being the best advocates for this disease. And more importantly, you need to be a great advocate for yourself. With that, we'll get started. So my topic is clinical trials. Now, so what do clinical trials do? They help us bring advances to the field. They help bridge the gap between laboratory science and human health. So what exactly is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are research studies that involve people, and it's really through these clinical trials that doctors can improve care and can bring advances to patient care. So researchers, when they're designing clinical trials, they do it in numerous ways. They actually can bring advances to all aspects of cancer care, not just for the treatments. So there are trials, for instance, in how to detect the disease, how to stage the cancers, how do we treat the cancers, how do we prevent cancers, how do we help patients deal with some of the symptoms from treatments. So clinical trials involve all aspects of cancer treatment, cancer detection, cancer staging, and including management of side effects. And it's really with these clinical trials that you can advance patient care, detection, diagnosis, and management. So these studies are really designed to answer questions and really to enhance treatments. So for instance, you could have clinical trials with new drugs, with new vaccines. There could be clinical trials for surgery. Are there better techniques available? Can we decrease morbidity? For instance, in breast cancer, there was a clinical trial. In the olden days, they used to remove the entire breast. Then there was a clinical trial where they only removed the tumor and then gave patient radiation. So many patients were able to conserve their breasts. And they demonstrated that patients have similar outcomes, where patients no longer needed disfiguring surgeries. So there are clinical trials ongoing in gastric cancer, also from a surgical standpoint. Then there are studies looking at different radiation aspects. Can we give less radiation? Because radiation, of course, as we know, has toxicities and has long-term toxicities. So there are clinical trials that can be undertaken to decrease the amount of radiation given without compromising on the toxicity or the long-term outcome. Then there are different trials that look at different combinations. So for instance, a single chemotherapy agent might have a response of 15%, but if you can combine it with another agent, you might be able to improve that response, as Dr. Ilsen described with ramucirumab. Yes, it's active, but when you combine it with chemotherapy, you see better activity. So there are trials that look at different aspects of treatment, different interventions, and many of these treatments were in clinical trials before. So what forms the standard of care today is really because of the work done in clinical trials in years past. So for that reason, it's very important to support clinical trials because they really help advances and bring these advances to patients. Here's another example. So for instance, in breast cancer, they demonstrated in the laboratory that tamoxifen was active. They then studied that in patients, in animals. Clinical trials then undertaken in patients, and now it's a standard of care for patients with breast cancer, and also it's been demonstrated to prevent breast cancer. So really these advances that are made in the laboratory need to be brought to patients, and it's really done through the means of clinical trials. So there are many different phases of clinical trials. So there are early phase clinical trials, there are late phase clinical trials. And my job today is to educate you what a clinical trial is and how to look for one, and how to be an advocate for yourself, and how to really make your way through the complexities of selecting a clinical trial and understanding what a clinical trial is all about. So, like I said previously, for a treatment to become standard, it must undergo rigorous testing. And there are 3 to 4 phases of these clinical trials. Now, the early phases of these clinical trials tend to look at patient safety, they'll look at scheduling. The later phases actually compare these this new treatments to what's the standard of care. And as a patient, you don't have to be involved in all aspects of the clinical trial. So just because you're taking part in a clinical trial, you're not going to be involved in all phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Patients tend to go on one clinical trial at a time. And it's important to understand what the primary goal of these trials are and how that might be applicable to you. So there are 4 phases. There's a phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what exactly are these phases? So a phase 1 trial is really to find a safe dose and then to decide how this treatment regimen should be given. So it could be looking at a dose, it could be looking at a different schedule, and they also want to see how these treatments affect the patient's body. The number of patients taking in a phase 1 trial are often 15 to 30 patients. So let's say you have a drug, so it all begins with a laboratory finding, where they find that a certain type of pathway is important in the growth of, let's say, stomach cancer. Then what happens is this will then be, there might be medicines designed that target this particular pathway. This is then studied in animals. Now, once it's studied in animals, this drug is now ready for human testing. But we don't know the dose. We don't know how it should be given. So that's what a phase 1 trial is, to look at what the dose is and to look at the schedule. And then you want to see what type of drug levels are achieved in the body. You want to look at the side effect profile. So that's a phase 1 study. Now, so for you to understand exactly, additionally, what a phase 1 study is, often new drugs. So if you want access to new drugs, a phase 1 trial is often the first step in this process. So let's say you've exhausted current treatments, and you're really looking for that new drug. You speak to your physician, and they say, well, there's this particular pathway that looks very promising, meaning that it seems to be involved in the growth of stomach cancer. And right now, it's very early. We don't have drugs that target this pathway. They are being investigated. So oftentimes, that might be a phase 1 study, where a new drug, they're looking to see what dose, what schedule, and at the side effects. So what exactly is a phase 2? So now that we've established a dose, we've established a schedule, we're now ready to look at it in that particular disease. So we need to know whether it works in stomach cancer. So in phase 1 study, often you'll find patients with all different types of cancers, because the primary goal is to establish the dose and the schedule. And of course, look at the side effects. But a phase 2 study looks at the efficacy of a drug in a particular disease. So you want to establish the activity in stomach cancer. So that study is going to have only stomach cancer patients. And obviously, we know the schedule, we know what type of side effects to expect, and the number of people taking part in this type of study can vary. It can be anywhere from 40 to 100 patients. And we want to see the activity in that particular cancer. We also want to study the side effect profile more carefully in a phase 2 study. So that's what a phase 2 study is. So what's a phase 3 study? So now that we know the dose, we know the schedule, we know it works in a particular cancer, the next stage is a phase 3 study, because you're going to compare it to the standard of care, because you want to bring an active drug into the treatment arena. So in order for that to happen, you have to establish that it's active, it can be, it's better than the standard of care. So a phase 3 trial compares the new treatment with the current standard of treatment, and this will tend to be a larger study, because studies obviously are designed statistically, and we have to demonstrate in a scientific a rational manner that a particular treatment is superior to the standard of care, and that's what a phase 3 study does. So the number of people that participate in this trial can be anywhere from 100 to several thousand. So what's a phase 4 study? So a phase 3 study will often lead to drug approval if the study is positive. A phase 4 study is when the drug is already marketed and there's a particular toxicity that the FDA might be concerned about or the company might want to study more effectively. That's what a phase 4 is, a post-marketing study to really look at the safety and effectiveness of a new treatment. And sometimes it even looks at special populations. So for instance, there's a drug Avastin, which is very similar to ramucirumab. When the drug was approved, there was some concern that elderly patients may not do that well. There were concerns that you cannot give anticoagulants. So in a phase 4 study, they studied these particular aspects of the drug. So it increases our knowledge of an approved drug. That's what a phase 4 study does. So it's important to recognize that clinical trials actually follow very strict guidelines. And it's actually, there's a prescription in place. So the person who conducts a trial is often a physician, and that physician is known as the principal investigator. The principal investigator then prepares a plan for the study, and that's called the protocol. Sort of like the recipe for conducting a clinical trial. Now, the protocol is basically the cookbook. So what it does is it tells you why the trial is being done, and the protocol is often the document that the physicians will refer to, because all patients need to be treated in a similar way. The drug needs to be given in a similar manner. You need the same type of patients in order to study a drug carefully. So the protocol will explain who can participate in the study, how many patients are needed, how do we adjust the doses when patients are on the trial, and what kinds of tests are needed to evaluate responses, and ultimately how this information will be analyzed for us to then bring that information to the medical community for the advancement of patient care. So who can join a clinical trial? Again, there are specific criteria because you want to study a homogeneous population. That's often in the eligibility criteria. There are clearly defined parameters as to who can participate in that trial. And why is that important? And the reason it's important is because you really want to study things in a rational manner. You want to have, for instance, in a phase 3 trial, you want to be sure that patients have a particular type of cancer, a particular type of stage, and what type of treatments they've received in the past. And it really ensures that people in the trial are as alike as possible. So why is this important? And the reason it's important is for safety reasons and to get accurate and meaningful study results. And safety, how is that? Well, for instance, if someone has a weak liver and you're investigating a drug that's broken down in the liver, if a patient has a weak liver, you're going to have more side effects. If someone has a compromised kidney and the drug is excreted through the kidney, you're going to have more side effects. So it could be potentially unsafe to give someone with compromised organs this agent. Also, if you have normal function, you could be overestimating the side effects of a particular medication. So it's very important from a patient safety standpoint to have patients in a similar medical condition to be on this trial. Also, in order for the study to be accurate and meaningful, you really have to have the same type of patients. So for instance, if we are doing a study in gastric cancer in metastatic patients, now if you've received more than 2 different types of chemotherapies, odds are that the cancer is a little more resistant. Also, it could be a little more extensive. You could also be weaker. And also, there could be genetic changes in the cancer that might occur. So, and these patients may respond differently to a particular drug as opposed to patients who've never received chemotherapy. So it's very important for us, in order to have meaningful results and for the information to be accurate, to have as homogeneous a population as possible. So what about randomization? At least where I work, there's a lot of concern that patients, that they're going to get a placebo and they're not going to get an active agent. So how do we explain why a phase 3 trial could still be useful in that setting? And how do we understand what this randomization really means? So a phase 3 trial, just to refresh your memory, is one where half the patients are going to receive standard of care, and we are trying to improve that standard of care. And so half will get standard of care, and the other half will get standard of care plus the new modality that's being investigated. So what a computer does is they randomly decide what group you're going to go in, okay? Patients cannot select what group they can go in, nor can the physician select what group you're going to go in. But what this ensures is that patients are equally distributed, and what's most important is that if a patient did not go in the trial, they would end up getting the same treatment. They would get the standard of care. And here, there's a 50% chance that you're going to get the standard of care plus a new intervention, okay? So care is not compromised. You will be essentially getting the same care that you would if you were to not go on the clinical trial, but there's a 50% chance that you might get a new treatment option. So, and it's randomization occurs in phase 3 studies and in some phase 2 trials. So remember I said a phase 2 trial is where you're trying to establish the activity of a drug in a particular cancer. Comparing these groups to each other will then show which treatment is more effective, and which combination has fewer side effects. And again, it's important to understand that there's an equal chance you will be assigned to either group, and no one really selects. It's a computer selection that will put you in one particular group compared to another. So that's what randomization is. What about placebo? So again, there's great concern many patients have, oh, am I just going to get a placebo? So what is a placebo? So a placebo is really designed to look like the medicine that's being tested, but it's an inert drug. It's not really active. Now, I think that there's, placebos really have seemed to fallen out of favor, but they are still used in some trials, and it's really to blind the physicians and blind the patients, so we report exactly what we're seeing, so that when the study data is being analyzed, there's no bias involved. So that's the purpose of the placebo. And again, let's say a patient is randomized to a placebo arm. Firstly, there's no way to know what arm, because patients will be, the subjects on the trial will be getting a similar type of treatment. The physician doesn't know who has a placebo and who has the active drug. But at the very least, let's say even if you are randomized to the placebo arm, you're still getting standard of care. So your care is not compromised, and that's very important to recognize when patients go on phase 3 studies. Now, what about patient safety? There are patients, at least where I work, some patients say, oh, am I being a guinea pig? Well, the answer is no. You're seeking newer treatments, and there are many procedures in place to ensure patient safety. First and foremost, patients get informed consents. These trials are conducted in an ethical manner, and patients' rights and safety is protected throughout the trials. So a trial, for instance, is very carefully vetted by the medical community, as well as the IRB, and also throughout the course of the trial, there's very close monitoring. So for instance, if a physician has an idea, oh, let's look at this drug in stomach cancer. Well, what happens is this physician has to come up with what exactly are they going to be evaluating, what the endpoint of the study is, what the dose of the medicine that you're going to be given. Then this is discussed with your peers, and then it is then submitted through, there's several layers of review. This is then reviewed by different committees. And then once it's approved, it is then, these trials are then, depending on the trial, a trial can be open at as few as 1 or 3 sites, or it could be open nationwide. And again, it depends. If it's a phase 1, it's going to be fewer institutions. If it's a phase 3, it's going to be open at multiple institutions. So once we've decided where the trial is going to be open, there's an IRB. And the IRB, Institutional Review Board, once again looks at largely patient safety issues, also determines that the trial is ethical and that it's okay for the institution to participate. That the IRB has physicians, it has patient representatives, so it's very carefully vetted by the time a patient goes on a clinical trial. Now, not only is there careful vetting before a trial is open and active, while the trial is being conducted, there's careful monitoring that's ongoing. So your research team will be monitoring you. The IRB also gets reports either annually or biannually, depending on the study. Additionally, there's data safety monitoring boards, especially on the larger trials that are looking at the data, making sure that there's no excessive toxicity observed. And also the organization sponsoring the trial it looks at the data in an ongoing manner, particularly toxicities, to make sure that it's safe for patients. So there's many layers for patient safety. The informed consent also explains what the side effects are. So what exactly is the informed consent? So the informed consent is a document that's given to patient that really describes the purpose of the trial, the nature of the trial, what it entails, what type of treatments you're going to be getting, what types of tests that are going to be undertaken. And oftentimes the team of physicians that are taking care of patients will explain what's involved in a particular clinical trial. Okay, so once all of this is explained, patients can then decide whether they want to participate in the trial. There's always an option to leave the study. We do encourage, once you do go on a study, to at least stick with it till the initial evaluation, because then you would have just taken a drug maybe for no benefit. And that really wouldn't be beneficial to you or wouldn't be beneficial to the study. Try to at least stick it out for the initial evaluation. There are dose adjustments that can also be made. So it's very important once you get on a trial to try to adhere to it. And if there are obviously concerns and toxicities, you should talk to your physician, because there's ways to work around these issues oftentimes. In the course of the clinical trial, it's important to know what your treatment options are. So whether you can go on, let's say, whether you can go on another drug, for instance, that may have similar outcomes to going on the clinical trial, you have to know what your options are before you commit to a clinical trial. Learn about what's involved in the study. So oftentimes when patients are on clinical trials, there's very close monitoring. And because there's close monitoring, it involves more physician visits, it involves more tests. So let's say you're in a rural area and you have to come for a clinical trial. It could be a hardship. So it's important to know exactly what's involved, and the informed consent and the physicians can also tell you what's involved in this clinical trial. And it's important to discuss the trial with the investigator and other members of the team before you sign on, so you know what it entails. The informed consent is often, the language is simplified so patients can understand. the side effects. They can also understand the procedures, and the study team is also there in order to answer your questions. So the informed consent has all the information that you need, including alternatives, purposes, procedures, risks and benefits, for you to be able to make an informed decision. And that actually brings me to a very, very important point. There's a lot of fear sometimes of, oh, am I going to be a guinea pig? Well, I think that you all, and that this is true for the entire disease, it's for cancer in general. It's important to make informed decisions and not a decision out of fear. Gather all the information, and then you can decide what you want to do, whether you want to do a particular treatment, whether you want to participate in a clinical trial. Have the information and make an informed decision, because it's true for life in general. The best way to make a decision is an informed decision, looking at risks and benefits. Okay, so some trials, actually, so you could say sign on a trial, and suddenly the trial ends early. And what are the reasons for that? So sometimes the trial's going very well, and it's very clear that you have a winner in one arm, the trial might close. Other reasons why trials close is if there's a lot of side effects, and it's excessive, and that the risk-benefit ratio is not favorable to continuing that trial might close. If study's not accruing very well, that sometimes results in closure of the study. And sometimes there could be a competing study that answers a question that's being investigated. So all trials are asking questions. So, for instance, they'll say, oh, is this medicine better than the other? Or another trial could, the main reason for the trial is this treatment less toxic than the other? For instance, in breast cancer, they have looked at 12 months of treatment versus 6 months of treatment, and there's absolutely no difference. And it's really a clinical trial that led to that answer. So clinical trials help advance patient care and bring newer, less toxic treatments to patients. And so by participating in the trial, you're not only helping yourself, but you're helping the scientific community at large and other people with these diseases. So what are the benefits? So first and foremost, you could have access to a new treatment option, or a treatment option that could be potentially less sick. And that's really is outlined in the consent, informed consent, as to the primary purpose of the study. Also, because the monitoring is so rigorous, the research team will watch you closely, and sometimes that's very beneficial, because they can pick up things that they may not necessarily pick up if it was just infrequent visits that you would have with the physician. Now, also, like I said, it brings current novel treatment approaches to you. That's the most effective way for me to describe what clinical trials does, because all of these trials, they are oftentimes based on preliminary observations. So even with a new drug, when you're in a phase 1 study, it's based on observations that this medication might block a particular cancer pathway. If it's a phase 2 study, you already know that there's some reason in the laboratory, or there's some investigation that's been done that this particular drug may be of benefit to you with your type of cancer. And a phase 3 study means that the drug's already demonstrated benefit in your type of cancer. So for that reason, it is the most effective way to, if you want to have access to new treatments, this is probably the most effective way to bring these treatments to patients. So the trial not only helps you, but it helps the scientists and the community at large, and ultimately paves the way for future treatments and a future standard of care. So, of course, if there are benefits, there's always risks. Okay, so what are these risks? Firstly, as you investigate, the new treatment may not necessarily be better than what's the standard of care. But there's no way to know that unless you do the study. Of course, new treatments have side effects, so that is certainly a risk, and it could be more toxic than the standard of care. But again, you don't know that until you do the study. And obviously, there's some promise, which is why the study is being done in the first place. Also, you might need more visits than what's required by standard of care. you might need more tests. There might be more blood draws because they're also trying to see, there are additional laboratory studies that are often done to advance the science of the disease while you're undergoing a phase 3 trial. So for instance, if you're in a large phase 3 trial, they'll take they might take your sample and do analysis, which might help us then down the road find out which patients are more likely to benefit from this particular treatment. So there's always laboratory studies that are tagged on to the most studies so that we can advance the laboratory aspect of it and patient selection aspect of it so that ultimately this guides future treatments. Now also, health insurance may not cover all aspects of care. So what is covered and what's not covered, and how do we know that your insurance is going to cover it? So to put it in very simplistically, if it's a patient care cost, the insurance will cover it, but if it's a research cost, the sponsor of the trial will cover it. So what's a patient care cost? So visiting doctors, hospital stays, standard of care treatments, treatments that are designed to eliminate symptoms, laboratory tests, x-rays that are part of routine cancer care, that's often covered. But if it's specific to the research study, let's say if I'm doing an extra study because this patient is on a study, then that would be a research test. So additional imaging, x-rays, laboratory tests, and the drug itself is a research cost. So federal law requires most health insurance companies to cover routine patient care costs even while you're on a trial, but you must be eligible for the trial, and the trial must be an approved trial. And the costs that are not covered is the research costs. And oftentimes, trials, when they are being designed, they will factor that cost in, and that will often be free to you, and that should be clearly stated in the informed consent. That should you need additional scans, additional tests, that the company and the sponsor is going to pick it up. So who's funding clinical research? So you have the federal government, several branches, the NIH, the VA, Department of Defense, state and local governments, private organizations, foundations, not-for-profit, industry. So there's a whole array of clinical trials that are being undertaken by different groups. Okay, so now that comes to how do you as a patient start the search for a clinical trial? First and foremost, like I said, you always have to be informed. So you need to know what cancer you have, which of course most patients do. You need to know the stage, okay? So many patients don't know what stage of cancer they are. And when you're doing when you're searching on the internet, advanced or metastatic means the same as stage 4 cancer. So advanced metastatic stage 4, often locally advanced is often stage 3. So it's important to know the type of cancer. It's important to know the stage of cancer. You also need to know what treatments you've received. So let's say if you get one chemotherapy and it stops working, okay? So when you're looking for a clinical trial, you're going to look for a second-line trial because you failed front-line therapy, okay? Because the first treatment you get is front-line therapy. The second treatment you fail is a second-line therapy, and the third is so and so forth. If you run out of all options, so phase 1 trials often will involve all patients, regardless of the number of treatments. So while you're researching on the internet, it's important to know your stage, know the number of treatments you've received, and know the kind of study that you're looking for. So phase 1's often, there's all comers. Phase 2 oftentimes is 1 or 2 prior treatment chemotherapy regimens. And phase 3, it depends. Again, it may be front line, second line, or third line, okay? So that's important. Then you find the clinical trials. So how do you find the clinical trials? Of course, you're going to go on the internet, and of course, there are going to be a million things that are going to come up. And I'm going to show you a website that gives you all that information. But what I think is the most effective way to find a clinical trial is to talk to your physicians, because they will know what's promising in the field, and a lot of them know what trials are open at their own institution and either within the area. And they can help guide you And oftentimes, these clinical trials have the eligibility criteria written on the internet. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and your physician will be able to tell you whether you can participate in that, whether you're eligible for the trial or not, because time is of essence when you have advanced cancer. You cannot be wasting your time going to one doctor, another doctor for opinions. You need to know, are you eligible for that trial or not? In general, it's good to look for a trial if you're functional. If you're in a wheelchair or bedbound, odds are you're not going to meet the criteria for a clinical trial. So if you're functional, you're independent, that's the time to look for a trial. And important, use your physician to help you, because otherwise you'll be looking for months, you'll be going for opinions, and you may not be eligible for the trial. The physicians can just take one look at the eligibility criteria on the internet and tell you whether you're eligible for it or not, okay? And then they can help you, and they can facilitate the process and get in touch with the investigating physicians. So take a look at the clinical trials that interest you, contact the team running the trial, ask questions, make appointments. I would suggest do it through your physicians, and it's going to save you a lot of time. But of course, if you're very savvy, it's always good for you to be doing the research as well, because your physician, it's always good to help your physician also, because you might find something of great interest, and you might be able to ask them that specific question. So where do you look? So finding a clinical trial, so I would say the NCI, clinicaltrials.gov is really the best site, okay? It has every clinical trial that's listed, and you can do a search by the type of cancer, the stage of cancer, and whether the trial is active and recruiting or not. So that's important to check that box, active recruiting. It will tell you the sites where these trials are open, and it also lists the eligibility criteria. So and in general, you need good organ function, and you need to be functional in order to get on these clinical trials, okay? So you will greatly expedite the process for yourself if you do some of these things. And of course, the advocacy groups are very important because they can make you aware of important trials. And it might be, there are different websites and different advocacy groups that list the relevant clinical trials in your particular disease. So that's another great resource. And of course, I can't speak enough of Debbie's Dream Foundation. They do bring the best and latest to you. Thank you.